I've been working on plovers for 30 years or so. Not piping plovers, but let me see where I get a stand so you can see that. I'm gonna have to help dance. So today what I'm gonna do two things. Is the first part of the talk, a bunch of pictures, just talking about the breeding ecology and population trends of piping plovers. And then the second part of the talk is going to be I'm going to talk about a lot of work we've been doing with telemetry and color banding and using that to monitor the full cycle movements of plovers. And so I think I have to do this. Sorry. Whoops. Sorry. Trying to figure out how to use I have this. There. So I don't know if you can read the quote from David Thoreau, but we're listening to piping plovers calling, and that's like emblematic to me for summertime on beaches in Rhode Island are the peeps of piping plovers. And their name is Pteradrius is the genus, and Melotus is the scientific name, the species name. So they're referred to in Latin as the piping plover. So a lot of I assume everybody here is a birder and used to looking at plovers. And these are the species of plovers that we get in Rhode Island typically. So some of these are common migrants. So in the center we have the piping plover. Just to the left of the piping plover is a semi-palmated plover that goes to the braided rivers of Canada to nest and then down to South America. Then also two other common migrants, black-bellied plover and American golden plover, that breed in the high Arctic. Some of the black-bellied plovers winter, but most of them go down to South America. Then we have killdeer that's nesting in upland habitats in the lower right. And then just above that, we have a young killdeer, which only has a single band. And a lot of times I get a call in my office, oh, I'm in Warwick in the parking lot. There's a piping plover nesting in the parking lot here. Well, it's a young killdeer. So they always misidentify it, big-eating birders. And then we also have for the Wilson's plover, which is a southern species that as a vagrant makes it to Rhode Island with that really large bill. And then on the left-hand side is snowy plover, which we'll talk about in a second too. So but they all look relatively similar. And they all have typical foraging mode when they forage, they're really fast runners. They have these large eyes on the sides of their heads that they can see predators coming from all directions. So they're visual predators. They're constantly running around the beaches with that relatively short, stubby bill. They're gleaning stuff off the surface of the substrate. So they're running between different prey atoms to forage. So very often they're feeding on ants or flies. Would be a typical prey atom for a piping plover. Occasionally you'll get something like a polychaete worm. So they can just use that with that stubby bill, they can get stuff just below the surface. So that's their typical foraging mode. And I'm sure a lot of you have gone to the beaches and watched them on the beaches in southern New England. If you look at the range of piping plovers, there's actually 3 populations of piping plovers in North America. And so in the Great Plains, there's one population that's listed as threatened, and there's about 2,500 individuals in that population. And then in the Great Lakes, there's only about 75 pairs of piping plovers, and that population is listed as endangered. So these are all federally listed populations. And then on the Atlantic coast, we have, they were first listed in 1986, and this population too is also listed as threatened, and there's about 2,000 pairs of birds breeding along the Atlantic coast. And then if you look closely, if you look on the coast, all the blue represents the wintering range. So all these different populations, winter, which I'll show a little bit more, winter along the southern Atlantic coast and then the Gulf Coast as well too. So the populations tend to intermingle on the wintering grounds. So the species that I studied for my dissertation was snowy plover. So they're the western equivalent of piping plover. Look fairly similar to a piping plover. Don't have that bright colored bill. But you can see they're mainly found the orange in the hypersaline lakes of the western United States. They also breed along the west coast, but they can see that they range fairly far south into South America and wintering along the Gulf Coast. And then there's some populations that also breed in Middle America. So the issue with piping plovers in terms of management is interactions with humans. And so here's Narragansett Town Beach, and obviously in the summertime, as you're all very aware, a lot of our beaches get lots of people using those beaches, and so there's not ideal plover nesting habitat anymore, and that really led to the decline of piping plovers in our region. And so a lot of plover management is actually human management to maintain populations in our area. And it's not just in Rhode Island. I took this picture recently in California. So there's a lot of the snowy plovers winter and nest on beaches in California too. So they have a lot of the same management issues that we experience with piping plovers. The snowy plovers also have too. So if you look at the typical movement phenology, and these are data from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, from eBird records about when they arrive. So piping plovers typically arrive, the first birds start to arrive in the middle of March, is when they first start to arrive. Usually the males arrive before the females. By the end of April is when they first start to nest, and then you can see the numbers of individuals. They peak in the middle of July, and then after the middle of July, the numbers of individuals start to decline in the region. Breeding's usually done by then. There are some late nesters, and then most of the piping plovers are left here by the 1st of October, some stragglers around. So they give some idea about when they're typically found in our area. So when they arrive in March and April, a lot of these beaches, and particularly the beaches they tend to nest on, there's not many people on those beaches, and so they start to stake out their territories. And you can tell the males and the females. The best way is based on the bill color. So the male up above, notice how it's got that bright orange at the base of the bill, and then there's a relatively abrupt black tip. And the females have a diffuse black tip compared to that orange bill. And the other thing too is males very often have a much broader black stripe on the head than the females do too. So if next time you go out and see plovers, you can try and determine the sex based on these plumage and bill characteristics. So anyway, the males tend to be, both the males and females are territorial, but particularly the males can be very territorial, and they mark these territorial boundaries. They do these figure-8 flights over the territories to maintain their territories. And then you think, oh, they're just a cute little piping plover. They're really docile. Let's see if we can change your mind. So they can't have battles. In territorial battles, it's like, get out of my area. This is my area. I'm claiming it. You know, and because we're in beaches and really linear habitat, and typical, it depends on high density. They can be, nests could be within 100 meters of each other or so. So they really stake out those territories. Then after they claim the territory, then they go through this courtship display, right? And so this is the male on the left and the female on the right, and he does this really quick high step in it, and I'll show you this in a second. That's the male on the right doing the high step it mesmerizes the female. It's like, and all of a sudden she gets hypnotized, and she goes, oh, copulation. There they go. And that's it. So so then copulation takes place, and then they deposit eggs. They deposit 4 eggs. Both the males and females incubate the eggs. They kind of share the incubation duties. Takes about 28 days, and they're deposited about 1 day, usually 1 to 2 days apart. But they really don't start to incubate until all the eggs are deposited, so they hatch at the same time. So very often, you can see the eggs are very cryptic, but very often they'll nest near some object that makes them maybe blend in the background. So like a white shell, so that you can imagine the white breast of a female makes it think that it's going to blend in more. And very often they nest in relatively open areas. With some vegetation, they really like to be able to see the surrounding habitat in case there's a predator coming nearby that can run off the nest. So that's their typical strategy. And I said both the males and females incubate. This is a nest exclosure, and you think, well, how do they get in and out of this nest exclosure so easily? And it's not really a barrier. Whoops, sorry. Wait. There we go. So this is just a nest exchange. So they'll just trade off. And then she'll go off on her, or he will go on their merry way to go off forage and etc. So typically they split their incubation duties. The female tends to do more incubation at night than the male, but it can vary. But you can see the nest exclosures, and it isn't really a barrier to them moving in and out of the exclosure. And then as I mentioned, the chicks, the amazing thing about it, even though they're deposited several days apart, they all hatch within the same 24-hour period. The chicks are precocial, meaning that they're fully feathered, they're fully capable of walking on their own, and both the parents help to raise the brood. So this is a newly hatched chick on the left, and younger chicks next to it. The young chicks, their strategy, when the parents will warn them if there's a predator or something coming nearby, and you can see their strategy is to, if anything, there's a threat, they just lay down and blend into the background. If they're moving, it's much easier for a predator to see them. So their strategy is just to hunker down, they blend into the sand, so it's really hard for them to see. And then it takes them, once they hatch, it takes them about 25 to 35 days to fledge, meaning capable of flight, depending on how they're doing in terms of food resources and other things too. This is a very happy young, this bird hasn't fledged yet, it's just practicing to fledge. And then, as I mentioned, both the males and females, a lot of, you know that there's not a plover that has 8 legs, so you know there's chicks with it. So they're very, particularly that first week of life, even later on, very often the chicks will go and be underneath the adult's wings to protect them from weather and predators and other things too. So if you look at mortality, so this is days post-hatch, this is in that first week of life when they're really vulnerable to not making it to successfully fledge. And in particular, that first 2 days after they hatch is when most of the mortality takes place. And very often the young chicks, they'll go down right near the water's edge, and then they'll get caught in the wave action too. A really young chick, and they just can't handle the wave action. But if they make it through that first 7 days, they have a really good chance of fledging. So that's when they're vulnerable. And the chicks, they're precocial, and the parents don't feed them. They're very active. So they're very, just like the adults, they're very active foragers. They use their eyes and that short bill to forage on their own. And the only role of the parents is just to warn them when there's any potential threats coming up, a predator or other things, and then they'll yell at the chicks and tell them to move and come and otherwise. So they're even from day one, they're out off foraging on their own and taking care of themselves.
Do the parents try to prevent them from going into the waves that first 2 days?
Yeah, I don't know if they're that quite. They haven't that part I figured out. They keep them a little bit away, but those accidents always happen. Yeah. So, as a lot of you aware, there's a lot of human management to maintain plover populations, and so what this strategy in Rhode Island and throughout New England is symbolic fencing to keep people away out of the nesting areas, and then some of the nests, not all of the nests, we'll put exclosures around the nest to keep predators out of the nests as well too, and so. These exclosures are usually take 2 to 3 people. The nest would be in the center. Usually they don't put the exclosure up until there's 3 or 4 eggs in a full clutch. They'll bury it in. They'll put the netting on the top to keep avian predators out of the exclosure. And these are data from 2021 in Massachusetts and looking at nest losses. So you can see that about 25 of the nest losses were due to the nest being flooded, overwashed. Predation, either suspect it accounts for about 50% of the nests lost, and then abandonment and other things too. So predation is kind of the main thing that's resulting in a lot of nest failures for piping plovers. And if you look at the types of predators, at least in Massachusetts for this 1 year, coyotes were 25% of the nest loss. Crows, fish crows mainly, and American crows in some beaches accounted for 31%. And then a lot of them, gulls and red fox and skunks and other things too. So a lot of mammalian predation, some bird predation is typical predators for piping plover nests. But given that, with all this management, done by at least in Rhode Island by Maureen Durkin with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Gene Cooper with the Nature Conservancy, the piping plover population has steadily increased in the region. So we've gone from 1980 of about 15 pairs, and we're up to 99 pairs as of last year. So it's been a very successful conservation story. Of those, I think 74 of the nests were managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and and Goosewing and other beaches. Nature Conservancy accounted for another 24 nests. So they've done a fantastic job of increasing the population. It takes a lot of effort to maintain the population. And this just shows nest success, productivity, so the number of chicks fledged per pair. So for the population to be stable and increasing, you need an average of 1.5 chicks per female for the population to increase. And that's the red line. So anytime the red line, though the productivity is above that red line, the chance of the population is going to be increasing. And you can see that a lot of the years, the population has been increasing, at least in Rhode Island. So there's been relatively high productivity in Rhode Island. So due to a lot of the work by the managers here. This, I don't know if it's how hard it is to see in the background, but the Atlantic coast population is divided into 4 subpopulations, and the recovery plan is to have at least 2,000 pairs in the Atlantic coast. And then that pink dotted line represents for that region how many pairs they want to have in that region, and the blue lines represent the number of pairs actually in that region. So that you can see that the only region where management has been very successful is New England. So the goal for New England is 600 pairs, and we're at over 1,200 pairs by now. And a lot of that's due to Massachusetts. I think last year Massachusetts had 935 pairs. So Massachusetts is really the heart of the range. On all the other areas, they haven't met, they're getting close in New York, New Jersey, but they haven't met the recovery goal. In particular, Canada is not doing very well. On both ends of the range, they're not doing quite as well. So New England is really leading to the recovery of piping plovers. And this hodgepodge, it just shows the number of pairs nesting on the various beaches in Rhode Island. And it's just to give you an idea that it varies a lot from year to year. So we need all these beaches to maintain the population in the state of Rhode Island. And it varies a lot from year to year in terms of productivity on a given beach, the number of pairs that want to nest on that beach. So we need lots of different beaches for them to nest on, for them to maintain their population. So this is what a piping plover looks like when it's fledged, and it looks kind of like an adult, but doesn't it's the same size, just doesn't have the dark marcation, etc. So this is what we hope to see at the end of the breeding season in Rhode Island. A lot of what I've been doing work is looking at the movements of piping plovers to get some idea of full annual cycle movements. And then one of the things we're really interested in is the potential for offshore wind development. How might that affect piping plovers, if it could affect piping plovers? So this is work that I've been doing with Paton with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and supported by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And so Chris Elphick mentioned the MODIS network earlier. And the unique thing about these transmitters is they can weigh anywhere from 0.3 to 2 grams. And it's a passive transmitter, so it puts off a VHF signal, and depending on the transmitter, puts off a pulse every 5 to 10 seconds. And you have a receiver system to detect that pulse. The amazing thing about the nanotag is it can last for several months or longer. And we also, at the same time, it's a little bit hard to see. If you look really closely, you can see the antenna coming off right here, and there's actually a tag on the back of that bird. So they're relatively small. And the yellow dots represent the receiving towers of the MODIS system to track their movements. And so the way we catch the birds is we find a nest, and then we put a trap over it, and then it's got a trap door, and we put a line from the trap door, and we just pull the trigger. So you hide behind the nearest vegetation, try to look really cryptic, and just act like, oh, they're not going to see us. And eventually they'll go back into the nest. They'll go in the nest, and you pull the line, and the door shuts, and then you have them caught. And then actually on the end of this, we actually have a mist net door on the other side, so they try and go at the back side, and they get caught in the mist net. So it works really well, and it's a good way to trap the birds. And then once we trap the birds, we just glue the transmitter cut some feathers on the back, glue the transmitter on the back, so that it's not sutured or anything. It's going to fall off after several months, and then we can monitor their movements. And then it just shows a picture of a plover with the transmitter on it flying away. So to give you an idea, so here's the MODIS tower network where we've seen before. And what this allows us to do is show us this kind of movement. So the black triangles represent different MODIS towers. And each of these towers has 6 antennas, and so we can tell based on the signal strength and which antenna was detected, we can figure out what direction the bird was, right? And then, so we use this to track, this gives you an idea of one flight of one bird. So this is an individual that was a female. It was after second year, so it was at least 2 years old. She nested on a critical island on Second Beach. So on the 23rd of June, she fledged 2 chicks. And then on the 4th of July, she initiated migration. And we know that she took off at 7:42 in the evening, and she kind of spiraled around upwards, and then she slowly made her way, or well, not slowly, 80 kilometers per hour. She made her way across Rhode Island Sound and the Block Island Sound, so went north of Block Island, then went off Montauk and headed on her way. So that took about an hour to go from Second Beach to off of Montauk. But we know that they're flying north of Block Island and south of Montauk to give some idea of the flight direction. So that gives an idea of, at the small scale, the kinds of information we can get from these transmitters. But then we can, each of these represent the movements of various birds and the directions they went. So you can see that they're not, before we started the study, we thought, well, what do they do? The birds that nest in Rhode Island, are they flying at the north end of Long Island Sound along the coast of Connecticut and down through New York and then making their way down the coast? Or do they do in the hypotenuse of the triangle and cutting down straight towards North Carolina, Virginia, etc.? We knew they were going to end up in North Carolina and Virginia, but how they got there, we weren't really sure. And the green and yellow polygons represent different wind and offshore wind energy areas. So we know based on the transmitters, the birds are flying offshore. And they're doing a straight line shot down to New Jersey or Maryland or even all the way down to North Carolina. So they're doing these fairly long distance offshore flights that often are near or above those offshore wind energy lease areas. Then we also tagged birds in Massachusetts as well too, and they did the same thing, although they even flew a little bit farther offshore. And these are the presumed flight pathways for birds going through Massachusetts. So a lot of those birds leaving Massachusetts are going through, those of you tracking offshore wind energy development, a lot of these lease areas right here are the ones that are going to be coming online in the next 2 to 3 years. And remember what I said earlier, the heart of the Piping Plover population is Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So the key population for Piping Plovers, the one that's really increasing, is the one that's going to be potentially exposed to all these offshore wind energy leases. Now the $1 million question is, okay, they can fly, even if they're flying over these offshore wind energy lease areas, if they're flying at 3,000 meters elevation, flying over it, it's not a collision risk. And that question hasn't quite been resolved yet. We're working on that, but that's one of the next questions too. So we have the telemetry. The other thing is we have all these birds, just like Joan was talking about with the roseate terns, these individuals that, in our case, they have a green flag on one leg and a blue band on the other leg. So if you ever see a piping plover with a green flag with a blue band, you know that I banded it in either Rhode Island or Massachusetts. And they'll have 3 alphanumeric codes on them. So if you see a bird, record that code and I can tell you who that is, when it was banded. And so we've gotten I think we're up to about 5,000 observations of birds now, and the ones that we banded. And so we can look at and see where the birds from Rhode Island, where they've ended up. So these are movements of birds from July through October. And you can see that there's occasional records in New Jersey or other areas, but the vast majority of the observations are down in North Carolina. And there's a staging area there at Cape Hatteras where we get lots of piping plovers that stay there for about a month or so. They undergo molt and then they migrate farther on. And then there's some individuals that go all the way down to South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida in that fall migration period. And so they can be, this just shows one individual that I banded in May in 2019, and that July it was seen at Forsyth in New Jersey. You can see, if you look closely, you can still see the transmitter on the back of the bird. So in July, it still had the transmitter. And then they can be site faithful to those stopover sites too. So there was one individual, UN9, that I banded in Rhode Island, and every fall it stayed at Ocracoke, North Carolina for about anywhere from 57 days, 50 days or so, almost 2 months. It would stay there. Then after North Carolina and those areas, and the other interesting thing is that we detected a lot more of the birds we banded in Rhode Island than Massachusetts. I don't really know why. The birds we banded in Massachusetts, a lot of them were from Monomoy, and if you know Monomoy, it's a very remote area, very few people around. So maybe the plovers from Massachusetts are much shyer, don't want to be near people, so less likely to be observed. That's just a guess. So if you kind of, just to summarize the movement, so they go in from Rhode Island down to New Jersey, which is about 250 miles, or if they make it a straight shot all the way down to Cape Hatteras, it's about 500-mile flight. So, to make it to New Jersey takes them about 7 hours. To get down to Cape Hatteras is about 13-hour flight. And almost all the birds are leaving right about at sunset, or after dark is when they're leaving, starting their migration. And then if you look at where they winter, so this time of year, they're either in the Bahamas, Bermuda, Turks and Caicos are the areas where they like to go during the winter months, based on observations of color-banded birds. And you can see more individuals we're detecting in Bermuda and Bahamas. And so they're kind of site faithful to their wintering areas too. So here's an individual that was seen for 5 years in a row at Cumberland Island in Georgia. And so they're very, and then there's another individual, that X2A that we banded in Rhode Island and also moved to Connecticut. And then she was seen in the Turks and Caicos in the same area for 3 winters in a row. So they're site faithful to their breeding grounds, and they're site faithful to their wintering grounds too. A lot of shorebirds have that strategy.
Do breeding pairs migrate together?
No. Usually the female leaves first, and then the male leaves after. And then, so why stage in North Carolina for that 2-month period? Well, they got to do, as I already showed the movements, they have to make it's about another 750 miles to make it from North Carolina down to the Bahamas. Or if they go all the way to Turks and Caicos, it's like almost 1,000 miles. So they have to build up their energy reserves again, get their feathers in good condition, and then make that final migration back. So this just kind of shows what I've, in one picture, just the full annual cycle movement. So the birds that we get from Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they're going down to coastal areas along the Atlantic coast and then down to the wintering areas shown in blue to give you some idea where our birds are going. So they're vulnerable to hurricanes and other events during the winter time. So that gives you a summary of kind of some of the management concerns for piping plovers and some of the things we've been doing at URI and with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I just wanted to thank Pam Loring on the right, who's done a lot of the work with the nanotag. So